Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 23rd episode of By-The-Bywater here at the very end of January, even though this will be our February episode for the year. Great to have you all back with us once again. When we all said it was going to be a nice new year when we recorded back in January 3rd, I don't think we quite realized what the next 4 weeks would bring, but here we are. Deep breath, and we hope you're all through it, one way or another. Anyway, the wider world is the wider world, and we've almost said all we need to say, although it is kind of nice to actually get some sleep on the weekends. Who knew?
Right.
But maybe we'll leave it at that. Hope everyone is doing well. I don't think we have no great personal news to share necessarily. I think we're all just muddling through at this point. Yes? No?
Yeah.
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 I will be getting married at the end of February, though, which is exciting.
So that means, wait a minute. Actually, that may impact when we record the next episode, but we'll get back to
It'll
that.
be a Saturday. Don't worry. It's
Okay,
fine.
all right.
Okay, as long as the podcast comes
not
first.
even.
Like,
Yeah,
I was about to say
exactly. Not even.
Marriage. Ah.
yeah. It's just a
Those
formality,
things-
right? It's like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. All right, but otherwise, we are as we are, and we're doing what we're doing, and there we are. So we won't steer any more of your time, because boy, we got a big main topic to talk about, but we do have some news, sort of, kind of, maybe in a way.
Ish.
So on that note, Jared, please take us into the news.
so once again, no new news from the Amazon series, with one sort of big exception, but not really. An official synopsis of the series has been confirmed, and while it's nice and all, there's very little in there that wasn't already known or able to be deduced. It's pretty clearly and understandably aimed at people who might have read the main books and seen the films, but that's about it. To quote some of the language, the show will take viewers back to an era in which great powers were forged, kingdoms rose to glory and fell to ruin, unlikely heroes were tested, hope hung by the finest of threads, and the greatest villain that ever flowed from Tolkien's pen threatened to cover all the world in darkness. Which, fine, even if Sauron isn't Morgoth, but anyway, there's a bit more interesting detail later in the synopsis. Beginning in a time of relative peace, the series follows an ensemble cast of characters, both familiar and new, as they confront the long-feared reemergence of evil to Middle-earth. From the darkest depths of the Misty Mountains to the majestic forests of the elf capital of Lindon, to the breathtaking island kingdom of Numenor, to the furthest reaches of the map. And beyond that, we'll see whenever we do, eventually, sometime. It's so weird to see the synopsis. It's so like weirdly overwritten. Like, what are they?
Yeah.
Yes.
Who are they trying to sell on this show that wasn't already sold?
It does feel like the back description of a paperback from the 80s.
It does.
And the things. It really
does, yeah.
So, come enjoy this missing. And, the back descriptions on the paperbacks of the 80s, Tolkien paperbacks, were, they had their moments, but they're not quite this level. This is more on the knockoff level.
Yeah, the breathtaking island kingdom of Numenor. Like it's Hawaii or something.
Right? The elf capital of Lindon, as though capitals were somehow a thing in elvish culture.
Yeah, like-
Which is not, that's not a thing.
Not really. It was like a city-state is kind of how
Yeah.
it worked.
And also the fact they talk about the tall forest there. It's sort of like, well, that makes me think of Lorien, but it doesn't necessarily make me think of Lindon. I mean, they can have them. There's no reason why they couldn't be there. But
I mean, this almost makes me wonder, like, canonically, the huge forests of Middle-earth that Fangorn is a part of were destroyed by the Numenoreans in their shipbuilding craze. So, like, is that going to be part of it? Is like the ecological devastation of Middle-earth? Is that?
I kind of think that would be a good relevant element. Let's put it that way. So
that would be great.
I mean, the wording of it all also just is very careful in terms of saying like familiar characters and new ones, i.e., you have no idea about the crap we're going to be making up for this thing.
Yeah.
Which, as long as they don't do what they did with Tariel in the Hobbit trilogy, the film trilogy, like that was just a mess and a half.
And then you find out that, in fact, Tariel is the last survivor of the famed legion of elvish archer women that laid things. You have no idea where it's going to go. Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
But yeah, no, there we are. We that's all we have. Literally, again, nothing else. I at this point, as we've talked about this before, it's beyond. Clearly, they keep everyone locked away. Clearly, they've they just put people in dungeons at the end of the night. They don't let them out. No one's seen their families for a year.
Yeah.
They throw raw meat down them, keep them fed, just keep away from everyone else. That's clearly what's going on.
Morgoth Clark is in her own cell eating lembas or something.
Yeah, exactly. So
look, as long as they give me the recipe, I'm fine with that.
So we'll see. We may have something for next month. We may not. Maybe this will never be ending. Maybe there'll just be dribs and drabs. Maybe it'll be 2030 and they'll be like, the first episode's coming soon. And yeah, we'll see. We will see. Okay, but otherwise, not much more to talk about because there isn't much more to talk about news-wise, but that means we can move on to the main topic, and we have a doozy of a one, and it is Oriana's turn. So Oriana, please, the floor is yours.
I have once again bitten off way more than any of us could possibly chew. But, this, once again, as all my topics are, all my topic choices are, it's a start. It's a little amuse-bouche, let's call it. And today's amuse-bouche is the Orcs, who on their face seem nothing more than cannon fodder. They are an enemy that provides a certain level of danger, a certain level of jeopardy, but they only really exist to sort of body the evil that threatens our heroes. They don't get too much personality. They don't get, they do get some personality, but what are they? Are they beings unto themselves? Are they a people with their own way of life, their own culture, which is sort of indicated by an Uruk-hai bellowing, "Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys," in the Peter Jackson films? Or are they more like bees with Sauron or Sauron's predecessor Morgoth as their queen, let's say? This is sort of a back entrance to the topic of life itself, like life with a capital L. It's sort of a bookend to my first topic choice of death, because life is something that Tolkien spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out and grappling with. Where does the soul or animating spirit really come from in the world of Middle-earth? And you can talk about elves and men all you like and the differences between them, but the question of what is life and where does it come from, I think is actually best answered by the existence of the orcs. The explanation for the orcs that we get in both Peter Jackson's movies and texts like the Silmarillion is that they were elves once. Tortured, mutilated, ruined by the dark powers, specifically by Morgoth, the great enemy, who could never give life himself and could only destroy. But Tolkien himself knew there were a lot of problems with this explanation, and he spent decades trying to come up with something more satisfactory and slightly less, shall we say, problematic. Because immediately on its face, you have this question, which is, okay, so the elves are a very particular type of being. They, and if the orcs are just sort of mutilated, corrupted elves, why don't they reproduce like elves, which is slowly and carefully and seldom more than twice in a lifetime? How are the orcs so easily destroyed when elves are supposed to be this very hardy race for, and when I say race in this case, I mean Middle Earth race, not
closer to a species, really.
Yeah, species, really. So there's the real issue here of Fea, which is the animating spirit of all the children of Iluvatar in Tolkien's cosmology. It only comes from Iluvatar, the creator himself. If the orcs are truly a people of Middle-earth, their spirits therefore must come from Iluvatar. But why would the creator give this spirit to what are ostensibly just hordes bred for the purpose of evil? And if they are truly capable of the level of cognition and being that a Fea usually gives, doesn't that make it genocide to kill them all instead of just attempting to sway them from their fealty to the Dark Lords? This is a problem, and in Morgoth's Ring, which is one of the volumes of the history of Middle-earth, and which I finally bought a copy of, we get a few essays written by Tolkien that wrestle with this question. And in one of these essays written in the late 1950s, he wrote, quote, "In summary, I think it must be assumed that, quote, talking is not necessarily the sign of the possession of a rational soul or Fea. The orcs were beasts of humanized shape, to mock men and elves, deliberately perverted/converted into a more close resemblance to men. They speak," he writes, "only as parrots speak," which, okay, it's a little strange, but it kind of makes sense. And it actually makes it seem like the more canonical portrayal may, in fact, be the Rankin Bass cartoon versions of the orcs, which more closely resemble animals than humans. But, so that was in the late 50s, and then by 1960, he seems to have come to an entirely different conclusion, which is that while the beings that the elves encountered before they went away into the West at the very beginning of the world were orc-like, they were not orcs themselves. They were merely evil spirits, because the orcs in this essay in 1960 that Tolkien wrote are now corrupted forms of men. Okay, this makes a little more sense too. More sense than if they're originally elves, and it makes Saruman's breeding of orc men, the Uruk-hai, fairly plausible, but it also kind of implies that the orcs can and should be treated as independent beings that deserve to be treated as though they are redeemable and worthy of mercy, and that they should not be treated with cruelty. So Tolkien's way of sort of squaring this circle is because the orcs never ask for mercy and tend to meet horrifying fates, is that, you know, he goes on to say that the orcs don't ask for this mercy because they have been led to believe that elves and men are even crueler than their current masters, Sauron and Morgoth, which to me makes them kind of tragic, sort of like how I feel about the average QAnon believer in that, right? So they have this degree of responsibility and culpability, but for sincere believers, they've been led into this extremely damaging worldview and genuinely fear for their own existence. But then, this is not all. Like, the dude just could not leave well enough alone. And by 1969, he had kind of decided to blend these two explanations where orcs are independent creatures of their own, but under the influence of Sauron and Morgoth were reduced to an ant-like life. But even that, he's like, oh, that's only a small portion of the total orc population. But once again, this doesn't quite solve the problem of how they have this independent consciousness, this something approaching a Fea or a rational soul, which once again can only come from the creator of the world. So my first question to you guys is, do you care at all about any of these explanations? Did you care before I chose this topic? Is it something that you really need an explanation for?
I mean, in a sense, yes. I mean, I cared before. I don't necessarily know explanations because he's basically just working out his own internal theology, which is like super interesting if you're a Tolkien nerd. And not so much if you're just reading the books and wondering, like, why there's an entire race of people that it's okay to destroy. It's really interesting to watch him come up with this story, which has meaning that he intended to put there, like orcs sort of representing the enemy, like the misled enemy, because there's a letter where he says, in the Great War, we were all orcs. Like, they are under propaganda. They have been influenced. This is what they think is right. That's all there. And then do that, publish the books, and then be like, what have I done? What does this actually mean? And work through all of this on his own and try to come up with some way. And it's almost infuriating that he's more concerned with whether it's internally consistent than what its real-world implications are.
I think it's interesting because Well, there are many different angles and things I can bring up, and I think part of that could wait for later realms of where a discussion could go. So I'm not going to, put all my cards as such on the table. But I think is sort of an interesting contrast to bring up, especially with that point about if the orcs essentially have been lied to, is that, and this fits in also with some of the military observations, and I'll get back to that as well, is the famed scene, which is both in the book and in the extended version of the movies, where in the book it's Sam, in the film it's Faramir, and they contemplate the dead soldier from the south who has been killed riding up on the Mumak, or part of the thing there. And the encounter with Faramir and his men and these forces around the borders of Mordor in Ithilien. It's a contemplative speech by Faramir. In the book, it's Sam's flash of a thought. In both cases, what you have is someone basically going, someone looking at this dead body of someone who's just been killed and going, was this person really evil? Was this person lied into coming here? The language is some of Tolkien's finest, frankly, in terms of just sort of moving aside from someone sort of the enemy to who is this person who had agency and is now dead. The key thing being, of course, in both these cases, is this person is seen to be human. Is seen to be a different kind of human in the sense of where they're from, what they look like, etc., but recognizably part of humanity. That is not given directly to the orcs. In an interesting way, these later essays are sort of him playing out this idea on a broader scale to another species, to another race, if you want to call it that, and trying to play that out. And maybe in contrast to these later thoughts of his, I was doing some rereading just now on some of the very earliest appearances of the orcs in the mythology, and that would be at the totally opposite end with the Book of Lost Tales, where the term is actually introduced. He does call them orcs. However, he does so in a very indirect way, and this makes sense given the instability of the Book of Lost Tales. It's by no means a thoroughly worked out collection of stories. While there is some language that lasted all the way up into the Silmarillion as published with some minor alterations, there are other things that went through radical changes. And in that case, what happens is, in a part where he never came up with a final version of the story, the orcs kind of are just simply one of many of Morgoth, in his original term, Melkor, or rather Melko, so one of the many servant creatures and monsters to him, one of the many species. He has both an overall term, and then he mentions the orcs along the way. So they just sort of emerge, they just appear, and he calls them orcs, and they're just, servants of the enemy, and that's all there is to it. And there's mention of initial battles between them and the elves who have left Valinor and are coming back to Middle-earth in search of the Silmarils, etc., etc. So they're introduced rather casually, and they develop over time. And I think it's interesting just to think about how the orcs is something that's sort of like, for him, it's like, oh, they're this. And then 50 years later have become this central, what have I created? What have I done here with this particular thing? And all its variant forms along the way, about which we can talk more later, because, of course, orcs have various sorts of existence. So that's kind of my initial throw in with this whole debate here.
Well, I mean, you're bringing up that moment with the Sam or Faramir moment, depending on which version you're familiar with. We don't get a similar moment exactly where a character is like, oh, this noble soul overthrown. But later, when Sam is in the Pass of Cirith Ungol and overhears the conversation between Shagrat and Gorbag. Sorry, those names. Overhears that, or then later when Sam is in the tower and overhears conversations between orcs, we get to hear them interacting, and they're hilarious. It doesn't trigger anything in Sam, but I feel like it's meant to trigger something in the reader, a similar process of reflection that is just not spelled out for you by the author the way that the other moment is, because we don't overhear conversations between various Haradrim or whatever. So I think, yeah, it's pointed to a lot that orcs don't get that speech, but I don't think we necessarily need it, because we get to see them behaving as people. And it's also interesting to me, I don't know how deep we wanted to get into the racism of the text, but they're often talked about as being stereotyped as, sort of like a Mongolian horde or whatever, and Tolkien himself compare them. This is such an appalling passage. Compares them to, he's careful to say, to Europeans, like he's clearly saying to Eurocentric standards, this is what they look like. Compares them to Mongolian people, which is so bad, and I'm so sorry for everybody who, anyway. And now I lost my train of thought trying to apologize for having to even say that. The orcs don't talk in a stereotyped, they don't talk like Easterners, quote,
No.
Easterners. They talk like lower class Britons, which is really interesting to me that it's not. It's hella problematic in so many ways, but not quite as problematic as you might think.
Yeah.
Because he's going back to the thing where he says, we were all orcs in the Great War. These are people who have been misled, dominated, or in some cases magically brainwashed into being what they are.
Something to throw in briefly, and then I want to pitch her back to Oriana, since she's actually, of course, leading this whole discussion, is that something I think that's an important corollary to that is we do see them as people, but we essentially see them in all cases in Lord of the Rings in a militarized context.
Yes.
They're either on missions, they're either on wars, we don't know anything else about their other society. The closest we get to that, oddly enough, is in The Hobbit, in the scenes where we have the Great Goblin and the Goblin Town, but even, of course, that's rather vaguely done. So there's something to that, and I could say more about that later, but throwing it back to Oriana if she wants to build off any of this.
Yes, that is actually, Jared, thank you for anticipating
You're welcome.
racism, so that is something that we can't really ignore, but it is something that is very interesting to consider because I believe I have something called aphantasia, or at least a form of it, which is the inability to form mental images. And in my case, I can't visualize text that I am reading. My brain doesn't, it just translates text to abstract ideas. I never visualize. I can do the reverse. I can translate images in my head to words, but even that is kind of, I don't think it's the same as other people who don't have this. So until the Peter Jackson movies, I actually didn't even have a picture of the orcs or the goblins. So I went back to the text to see how, I was like, oh yeah, how are they actually described to us? And what was interesting is that in the texts of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the orcs are mostly described in neutral terms. Their appearance is it's not commented on a whole lot other than it's usually size or, how long their arms are, or occasionally there's like skin color, which is usually like black, but not as we think of it, as in literally the color black. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a racist inspiration for the appearance, for their appearances. So what Jared was talking about, the evidence for this is mostly from a letter that Tolkien wrote in 1958, I believe, wherein it's part of a much longer letter where he is strongly objecting to a film treatment for The Lord of the Rings. And so the section about the orcs reads, trigger warning for, some really awful racism. But so it reads, why does Zimmerman, who is the man who wrote the treatment, why does Zimmerman put beaks and feathers on orcs? Orcs is not a form of ox. I don't really know. The orcs are definitely stated to be corruptions of the, quote, human form seen in elves and men. They are or were squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes, in fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. That's a big yikes. That's awful.
That to Europeans is doing so much lifting.
It really is. It really is. It's like, and yet it's still not quite enough. Yeah. It's still not enough. But that's what's so, like, that's kind of the only real, it's interesting to me that the inspiration is clearly at least somewhat racist, but the language used to describe them in the text itself is not. It doesn't quite reflect that. Or maybe that's just a function of my inability to visualize. How did you guys, do you remember how you visualized them before we saw them depicted in film?
I visualized them as sort of ape-like. not really as people at all, because they are described in fairly bestial terms. They've got like fangs and claws and that kind of thing. And there is a very unfortunate passage where I think it's in the Bree section, where they talk about somebody being half orc because he's sallow and slant-eyed. I'm so sorry, everybody. But that didn't, to me, that when I was like little, when I was a little kid anyway, that didn't really square with the rest of the text where they are pretty animalistic. So I was like, oh, I'll ignore that and move on, because I didn't know what to do with it. Now I know that it's pretty appalling. But yeah, I just pictured them as sort of ape-like. That was it.
And in my case, the Rankin Bass version was the first, time I encountered them as a concept. But after that, in just terms of rereadings and other interpretations, there was the Bakshees, but also various other illustrations. Yeah, I don't know. It was, I want to say it was almost kind of hard for me to put my finger on in a weird sort of way. It was also contextual in this sense, and this sort of speaks to the broader initial after echo of Lord of the Rings and wider culture. One of the vectors, of course, for a lot of what Tolkien is sort of, I don't say introduced, maybe codified, gets played out further in Dungeons and Dragons in particular. Of course, a mythos and a world that goes through its own revisions and reconceptions and things like that over time for more collective points of view, depending on who's in charge at any one time. And orcs, at that case, were introduced into the universe, and so were ants, of course, but they had to be renamed. They were called tree ants.
God, I hate that.
And that's its own thing. But orcs got to remain orcs, and I think goblins and hobgoblins, and of course you get into all the armor classes and hit points and things like that. But setting that aside, you got senses of just various sort of portrayed characters, and people were sort of running with any number of different interpretations. But a common thread I remember there were complaints about this, were that you had not so much orcs as porks. In other words, orcs that were portrayed with pig-like features that actually had snouts and sometimes fangs, like, walking, talking boars, if you will. I can't say I never locked into any one version of any of these as being definitive, to answer the question. I would say that by the time the films arrived, it gave me a further option, but I don't know if it's that the option still. I think it's sort of like, okay, that works.
They're a lot grosser in the movies than they are in the books.
Yeah. I mean, they're just straight up monsters in the movies. There's very little human about them in the movies, which is interesting to me. You can't erase the racist origin, but you can you rectify that? Like, I think that the Jackson movies, I'm not of Asian descent, so I can't say definitively that they are not I didn't read Asian racism in the portrayal of, or in the way, in the monster design, I guess, of the Peter Jackson movies. But is there a way where we can further move away from that in other adaptations?
Yeah. Yes.
Hooray!
I very tentatively saying yes. It's such a complicated topic in every respect. If you make them just full on monstrous, the way the Jackson movies do, is that better or worse than dealing with the uncomfortable implications of them having a culture and them being maybe cousins of humans and elves? How do you solve that problem, or do you just try to ignore it and make it somehow worse, kind of the way the Jackson movies sort of did, by creating a culture of monsters? I mean, the orcs are still funny in the Jackson movies, like the Meat's Back on the Menu Boys or whatever.
Yeah.
But in some ways, it's almost worse to have this entire species just be monstrous, to me. I don't know that there's a solution that would make everybody happy, aside from just not adapting Lord of the Rings. But
right.
There's an element, too, that I think ties in as well with a lot of other features that we find in Tolkien's Middle-earth over the years, because besides the orcs themselves and various other evil creatures, you have one after another of a series of endless hordes, normally from the east, which is loaded in terms of Eurocentric history. whether you're talking Attila the Hun or whether you're talking the Mongolian empires or et cetera, so things like that. The reason why I bring this up is that there are elements, I seem to remember, this is something that's in the Silmarillion, which of course is more of a compilation of ideas as edited and written out from various sources, but obviously this draws on various earlier texts as well. So you could call this before Tolkien's sort of crisis of conscience of the 50s and 60s about what exactly the orcs are. And talking about how, again, though, notably, even though we see no female orcs, the orcs are supposed to breed rather rapidly and basically always seem to come back pretty quickly from times when they're mostly wiped out. And that put me in mind of, speaking of virulent racism, but I think it must be addressed, the ideas of something like in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century, right around the time when Tolkien was growing up a young man and taking in ideas, even though he, reacted to them as he did, a insanely racist and popularized conception of what what was happening in East Asia, as we now know it, was the source of the Yellow Peril, a terribly racist term, because the idea is that there are these hordes and hordes of, whether it was China or things like this, and they were going to may end up, sweeping over the world. You have racist constructions like that of Fu Manchu, created by the pulp author Sax Rohmer, and things like that, along with many other stereotypes that, again, this I do not feel equipped to talk about in detail, and we are not a podcast about. These all feed into what's going on with this, but the orcs themselves, again, unlike all these other human cultures that are talked about, exist in a very, very odd area. And I'll tie this now back in something I said I was going to bring up earlier. Let's maybe talk about it a bit further. It is explicitly militarized culture. It is, for what we see of it, it is a case where, even though it's militarized, it's not necessarily uniform, because you get senses of everyone fighting each other as much as fighting perceived enemies. You get a sense, again, that there are female orcs. What are they? We literally have the name of one female dwarf. We at least know that much exists, but we have no idea of such a thing as a female orc. And again, we're talking about a very, very blunt gender stereotype here, but this is how Tolkien tended to see things. This is kind of where we're at. We're dealing with this sort of limited viewpoint, and the fact that Tolkien seems to identify so strongly that orcs themselves are essentially, people stuck in a military situation who hate being there and are under intense stress and pressure and seem to hate each other as much as is going on there. It's sort of like an anti-esprit de corps is what it is. And it was mentioned a little earlier, and I think it's worth bringing up the idea that Jared pointed out that, he feels that Tolkien himself felt like, being like, orcs when you were in the military. And he equates a lot of his World War I service with that, about how, like, what he saw around him, people in the barracks, the talk, the food, the things like this.
Yeah.
He really sees on this level. It's very much him consciously distancing himself from his surroundings and the context he was in. He loathed it, and I think it's very telling. Incredibly telling that in the Scouring of the Shire, when everyone returns and they're all having that first meal in the new little spot by the bridge and all that, and everyone, Sam and everyone's getting all annoyed with what they're seeing, and Sam complains all these stupid rules and nothing but a bunch of orc talk. He specifically calls it orc talk, and he's experienced it in his own way, his own experiences, and now he's seeing it there. So it's almost like, are they even separate people in the end? Is this his projection of just sort of like, this is what happens, when you're forced into the situation? Maybe that's another way to think about it. I don't know. I mean, but this, I think, is another inescapable element. I mean, it's just this derivation and reduction of a very particular human experience, and then it becomes the entirety of a species' existence. It's kind of what it is.
Well, it's not just militarism that the orcs are stuck in. It's totalism. This is like, they are explicitly a people. They are the main sufferers of the totalitarianism of Sauron in particular. And I think that was the thing that was one of the defining forces of Tolkien's time, was the appearance of totalitarianism, where before it just hadn't quite we hadn't quite seen this before. And so I think even beyond just the militarism, it is this like the orcs are subject to these totalitarian rulers. And, those totalitarian regimes didn't spring up first in the East. The reason the East is the bad guys in The Lord of the Rings is because the West is the good guys, and the West is the good guys in The Lord of the Rings, not because of any weird concept of Western Europe, but because it comes from the Celtic cosmology of the West being the land of the happy dead, the land of the fairies. That's where that comes from. But of course, I don't think you can discount the possibility of influence of Orientalism and just racism against East Asia in particular. But I don't think it's quite as simple as how some of us map that, Western chauvinism, because the totalitarian forces that Tolkien encountered was Nazism, it was Stalinism,
Yeah, Morgoth arose first in the north.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's if you look at all of the stuff that orcs are repeatedly condemned for, like orc mischief, as Treebeard keeps saying, none of it, as far as I can remember, is cultural exactly, or like for their physical characteristics or anything like that. I mean, the narration is kind of like, oh, they're gross animals, but most of what people complain about them doing is ecological stuff. Like cutting down trees, pollution, that kind of thing. And that's all markers of a, quote, advanced society. Like that's what Western Europe was doing when Tolkien was writing this. And that's what he was most angry about. So he gave them all of these weird, like dog whistly traits. But then the stuff that the actual evil that they do is not racist. It's just crimes against nature, which is that Western Europe was perpetrating. And it's so annoying to me that he created this embodiment of everything that he hated, and then decided, like, oh, it's just a trick of geography that they come from the East. Like, it was so disingenuous, I feel like. He'd be like, no, it's not. They're not actually Asian. They just happen to be in the East because that's where Sauron is. And it's like, no, come on, dude. Don't do this. You can make your point about ecology without that.
Without being an eco-fascist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's a very good way to look at it. I'm trying to put my finger or two on a couple other points. Maybe it's something good to talk about here. We sort of talked about the orcs as they emerged and as he was finally thinking about them, but it's kind of good to sort of think about them along the way because, of course, the way they were first introduced, even though it's one of those classic sliding terms in Tolkien, is that they were essentially introduced in The Hobbit, and of course they were called goblins there. And even though he'd already come up with the term orcs, and I'd have to dig in more into the manuscript, a very good read of the manuscripts of the making of The Hobbit. Excellent two-volume book by Tom Satowski, and John Rateliff is the main author, who, in terms of how that sort of emerged over there. But of course, in keeping with The Hobbit being a ultimately different beast than The Lord of the Rings as we know it, and the formal version of the universe as we know it. You have our goblins there. They're as close to, you can't call them lovable, but there's something more approachable about them. Maybe is the best way to put it. Yeah, because Tolkien talks about them as sort of like as goblins, as the type of things that are clever and have created the type of weapons that are used for killing a lot of people at once and things like this, a sharp enough commentary and things like that. When you get down there, I mean, the bulk of the conversation is between the Great Goblin and Gandalf, basically just going back and forth and trying to, I don't want to say outsnark each other, but trying to be like, why were you here? Oh, we're just traveling. So, or not Gandalf, Thorin. Thorin,
yeah.
I was going to say, somebody's going to tweet at you.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Yeah. But Thorin and the Great Goblin going back and forth. And, in the context of the wider histories of Middle-earth, even established by that point, but especially later on, you get a sense that this is incredibly anomalous. It's more sort of like, oh, we capture a bunch of dwarves. Let's kill you immediately because you're absolutely horrible. And, dwarves would do the same thing given to them. I mean, there's even the mention in the very first part of The Hobbit about the whole Azog and Moria and, that whole thing, which was a bitter, bitter, horrible civil war. And Tolkien, since he never did get around to doing a full revision of The Hobbit, didn't essentially adjust for that. So, we have it essentially, canonical that, after this incredibly bitter war of extermination, you've got a leader of an orc remnant in the Misty Mountains with one of the main people who did all that, and they're just soaring back and forth. It's like, oh yeah, where are you going? Oh yeah, we're visiting relatives. What? It's just, and of course, infamously but hilariously and amazingly, these goblins sing.
Yeah.
Twice. They have their "We've Captured You" song down to Goblin Town, and then they have the 15 birds and 5 fir tree songs when they're about to set them on fire later. And you don't get that in any other version of the Orcs at all. It's just kind of amazing. It's just sort of like, and it fits with the story The Hobbit as it's originally told, in particular, before the revisions, before things get really serious, before there's a sequel, when it is at that point merely an outgrowth, very indirect, of Tolkien's own private mythology, which at that point is only 15 years old and is still up in the air. And he's taken elements from it and derived this little cutesy, I don't say cutesy, but it kind of is, children's story about it.
Yeah.
And he's got these fun bits. So it's this other way of thinking about the goblins that is not so, I don't know, that is not so extreme is the best way to put it. They are enemies in the end, of course. They are eventually going to try and kill them, even though they're doing it in a rather, let's see you get it out of this Mr. Bond way, and then they do. And then there's the big final battle at the end, of course, and they are literally a almost faceless horde at that point. There's no, we dig and exchange, they just come and invade, and there's the Battle of the Five Armies. So, I try and keep that in mind, and I will also say this in terms of descriptions of the orcs. We were just talking a couple episodes about the Father Christmas letters. Well, we have goblins in that. And that's really the only time that we see, if I remember correctly, Tolkien's own portrayals of what these figures could be like. But of course, in that case, they're diminutive, they're cute in a way. There are a lot of them. They're mean. Yeah. And there's these little sort of like pointy-headed black figures going around, and the elves are trying to kick their butt and things like that. And it's Santa's elves, of course. So everything's much lighter and much different. So it's as close to sort of like maybe they look like that, kind of. But again, you can't really tell. I mean, nothing. I had no overarching thoughts. Those were just things kicking around my head. So
yeah, it's almost sort of like the Gremlins in Gremlins. Not the cute little gizmo kind, but the over Christmas we watched Gremlins I had not seen it. I saw Gremlins for the first time, and I was like, yes, that's like orcish, but like Hobbit orcish. Right. Hobbit goblins.
Where the hobbits were the ones made.
So I feel like that's kind of a fairly good start, at least. God knows some of these themes will keep cropping up over and over again, but that was kind of what I wanted to accomplish.
I will throw in one other thing that I think we can't entirely overlook, and it was touched upon, though, by Jared, and that is, we've been talking about it more in these specifically, rapist/crypto-racist terms. Let's talk class. We might be missing the forest for the trees, ironically, in this particular case when it comes to them, because, of course, there is no such thing as a fancy-speaking orc. The closest we get to it is someone maybe like the Great Goblin, but even then it's a little more conditional. But, all the orcs that we encounter in the book, everyone's pretty pissed off, pretty much almost all the time. That's one determining factor. But the other determining factor, and this is also something we see with the trolls in The Hobbit as well, particularly, maybe even more clearly, it's sort of a debased/alternate I don't want to just simply say Cockney. I think that's maybe too reductive, but there is a sense of, they're not speaking in country dialect. They're speaking in a kind of, they're speaking kind of, down there, type of thing where it's sort of like the language is aggressive, the tone is aggressive. They're not speaking in any particular slang that we recognize per se from various English dialects, but it's not that far off.
Yeah.
He really, and Tolkien knows his language. Tolkien knows his dialects. Tolkien is using these, is making very conscious choices here. Is it something that, is he arguing that unconsciously? Is he arguing some sort of thing that, if we see something like, we don't see the orcs in cities, having cities per se. There's Goblin Town, but that's about it.
Yeah.
But they have fortresses, they have strongholds, etc. Miniature cities, if you want to call them that. Minas Morgul, if you like. But it's this sense of, it's almost a portrayal of this sort of like this lingering, simmering fear/projection of what the working classes may be like in a specifically industrial context. That might be the best way to put it in a very broad sense, but you can't ignore it, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that that complicates things even further, because it's sort of like, oh, is that what you think of things, huh? Yeah, and where does that come from, and what roots are there, and does that tie in with Tolkien's own feelings about industrial living versus versus sort of idealized life in the country? You go back to his youth. You want to play the biographical card. His fairly comfortable-ish living when he was a small boy in the English countryside, and then he and his brother and his mother have to move more into Birmingham and more into an urban context, and things get crappy, and he sees and hears people around him, and where do you go with that? I think that is a factor, and I think we can't hand wave it.
Yeah.
Is really what I'm trying to say there.
I don't know if I want to call it classism exactly, just because it's more of there's a good lower class and a bad lower class. Because like Sam is a lower class hobbit and he talks like a lower class hobbit, but he's a rural lower class hobbit. The orcs are not rural; they are industrialized, and I wouldn't say urban because we don't see them in cities, as you said. But they're like, it's okay to be lower class as long as you're gardening. Which is a weird,
or farming, or
weird sort of quasi-classism, I guess.
Yeah, it's I guess maybe not class, but just just an outgrowth of the anti-industrialism, boy, I'm sure he would have had some thoughts on inner cities.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad he's dead.
Yep. I was just thinking the exact same thing.
Love the guy, love his stuff, but
oh God. Yeah, that anti-industrial strain is very, very strong. It's like, this is what happens when this is the only way industrialization works is to reduce the people who, is to reduce society to orcs, essentially.
Yeah, and I think too that there's also a tie-in, and this gets a little abstruse, but I think there's something to it. Is that even in the choice of words and the language and the perceived ugliness of it, we have Tolkien as a linguist who was a linguist with aesthetic ideas. Is the thing, and this is much as clear in stuff like A Secret Vice and stuff like that. In fact, one reason why I like the critical edition of The Secret Vice, again, for those unfamiliar, is that's his essay from the 30s that he presented as a lecture about his interest in creating languages, which grows out of his interest in languages, period, and how he had views of which languages and what tones were better or purer than others, as opposed to a more analytical, oh, this is the language as it's evolved, which is a much, dare I say, more neutral and better way to think about it. So, so we have to keep that in mind too. It's a sort of like if you aestheticize, how people speak, you get into some really tricky areas right there. What does that mean? And we see that in America, of course, in many different ways. Don't get me wrong. This is not a uniquely English viewpoint at all. If you think otherwise, I don't know what country you're living in, being blunt here. So that's a factor too.
That is one thing. This is sort of a tangent, but God, a while back, I don't know, a year or two ago, I had a piece published in Vox about the original idea was like, not just about how people create languages, because everyone in the world has written about that at some point, but to, how languages are created specifically for television and movies, and the general, like the whole, from soup to nuts, like why do people do this in the first place, all the way down to actors speaking it. And one of the most fascinating things that came up while I was writing this, both in the people I talked to as sources and just in the edit process, was the number of people who insisted that like Dothraki was meant to sound harsh and guttural because like the Dothraki are a more primitive people. And I was like, no. That's, it may sound harsh to you, but that is an entirely subjective criteria, and like we cannot make that. The David, oh God, what's his name?
David Salo?
Yeah, no, the guy who did Dothraki and
him.
Everyone knows him. Nice guy. But he, like, in particular, really opened my eyes to that, like, subjectivity, and was like, people kept talking to him about the harshness of Dothraki, and he was like, it drove me nuts because a K sound is not inherently like harsh. It's your perception of it. And it is interesting that Tolkien kind of didn't really seem to cop to that as well as maybe he should have.
It's definitely an older perception of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he hated modern English, which is funny to me.
And
so,
Irish, too.
Yeah.
Why? Who hates
Well, he hated the grammar
Irish
of
Gaelic?
Irish. It offended him aesthetically, which is so funny to me. It's like...
It's so bizarre. It's so bizarre.
Like, I have a beef with French grammar right now, but, like...
Sure.
I think part of it is also shaped by how languages and cultures, let's say, are perceived and understood by later generations. Let's give an example. Even though, of course, Tolkien was by no means a classicist, he grew up, having to learn Greek and Latin and took the courses and things like that. And so there's this idea that Latin is this, incredibly formal thing that's, very, very polished and stylized. The terms that we get that come down from it, the idea that it was nothing but speeches in the Senate that are very elevated and various pronouncements and all that. And then, of course, we have no recordings of how Latin was actually said for fairly obvious reasons by the culture at the time 2,000 years ago. And two, legendarily in Pompeii and elsewhere, and things like this, and the TV series Rome actually did a kind of really good job of pointing this out. Graffiti everywhere. They're pretty much like, this is not exactly an elevated language that people are always speaking highfalutin things in. They're calling each other the worst things in the universe.
Pompeian graffiti is one of my favorite things.
It really, really
Was
is.
that a Twitter thread recently, or was it just in our Slack or something where someone...
I think it was a Twitter thread, yeah. So
every so often, Twitter rediscovers Pompeii's graffiti, and it goes viral, and it's so funny.
It's the only good thing about Twitter. I'm like 10 days into no Twitter, and my life is actually very much improved. But I do miss that.
We don't blame you at all. So, well, gosh, Oriana, it is your topic. Do you want to have any last thoughts to wrap things up?
In conclusion, the Orcs are a land of contrasts. That's kind of... They are very problematic, but also very interesting. Like, he spent so much time and energy trying to figure out what he had done. Like, no reflection on the racism, but like a lot of reflection on, do they, like... oh no, where does the soul come from, basically? Never quite figured that out. Right?
Oh, you're such a nerd.
Why? And why do you think we're fans? No, anyway. Next episode is Jared has the main topic. What are we talking about?
Gonna talk about other things. Wizards.
Yes!
Oh.
Who are they? What are they doing? What happened to the other two?
Yes.
Yeah, not just that specifically, of course, but yeah, it's such there's so much there. Not as much as Orcs, maybe, but
There's like a little less racism.
a little less to like tap dance around for sure.
But yeah, no, we wizards, do they all have long hair? Do they all have stabs? The answer, well, we'll find out. So,
The answer may surprise you.
plenty to read about that. I will give a recommendation for anyone who wants to do some advanced reading. There is a section in the Unfinished Tales called the Istari, which is more or less the main collection of stuff about wizards and in Middle-earth, although there are, of course, many other things besides. So keep that in mind if you would like to do some advanced stuff. We'll be recording that at the end of February for an early March release. And in the meantime, well, we've gone through another episode. We've made it through, and we hope you enjoyed it as always. We look forward to coming back to you in a month's time with that topic. We look forward to maybe having some more news at that point, but guess what? We're probably not going to have any. At this point, we'll just be reduced to reading through the technical lists on IMDb going like, well, this is what this person did. So
The cinematographer also worked on this. I love that movie. Let's talk about that movie.
yeah. So we'll find out when we do. As always, though, thank you very much for listening. As always, thank you for any feedback and stuff you send. We hope you enjoy it. We will all talk to you next month. Until then, we'll see ya. Bye. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By the Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By the Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.